The Quiet Man and the Forgotten Birthday. The rain had just stopped falling over Los Angeles when Keanu Reeves walked into a small cafe hidden behind tall green vines. It was early morning and few people noticed him. His black hoodie was pulled low and his eyes looked tired, like someone who had carried too many memories for too long. The world saw him as a movie star, a man of calm strength and quiet mystery. But behind that stillness lived someone who had learned how to hide his loneliness behind gentle smiles. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, and sat near the window. Outside, the reflection of wet streets shimmered like liquid glass. A young waitress recognized him but said nothing. She simply brought his drink with a shy smile. Keanu thanked her softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He was used to being alone. Birthdays had become something he no longer celebrated. They were reminders of years passing, of people gone, of love left unspoken. This year was supposed to be like every other. No calls, no parties, no noise. He planned to spend the day reading an old novel, riding his bike, maybe feeding the stray dogs near his home. But life, as always, had other plans. At the same time, across town, Sandra Bullock stared at a calendar on her kitchen wall. She had circled that date months ago in quiet red ink, with a small heart beside it. Keanu's birthday. She smiled as she remembered their first conversation on the set of Speed decades ago. Back then, she had instantly sensed his gentleness. Not the kind of gentleness that came from politeness, but from something deeper, like a calm soul that had seen pain yet refused to turn bitter. She had not seen him in months. Their lives had taken different paths. But something inside her told her to reach out that morning. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was care. Maybe it was something more. She didn't know. All she knew was that she wanted to remind him that he was not forgotten. She opened her phone, typed a message, and then erased it. No text could hold the weight of what she wanted to say. Words felt too small. So instead, she made a quiet decision. She would surprise him. No cameras, no press. Just her, an old friend, and a small gesture from the heart. By noon, she was in her car, driving through light traffic. She stopped at a small bakery near Sunset Boulevard and picked up a chocolate cake. The shop owner, an older woman, smiled when Sandra said the name for the icing. For Keanu. The woman nodded warmly. That's a kind man, she said, as if the world already knew the truth about him. Sandra laughed softly. Yes, she whispered. He really is. Meanwhile, Keanu left the cafe and started walking through a nearby park. His phone buzzed a few times, but he ignored it. He had grown distant from the noise of constant messages. People often reached out when they needed something, but rare were those who reached out just to share silence. As he walked past a bench, he noticed an old man feeding pigeons. The man smiled and said, "They remember the ones who feed them, son." Keanu smiled back, not realizing how much those words would echo later that day. By the time the sun began to set, Sandra arrived outside his modest house. She looked around quietly. There was no sign of any celebration. The curtains were partly open, revealing a single lamp glowing inside. She took a deep breath, held the cake close, and walked up the steps. With every step, her heartbeat grew faster. She hesitated for a moment at the door, wondering if this was too sudden, too emotional. But her heart pushed her forward. She knocked once. Inside, Keanu froze. He rarely had visitors. The sound of that gentle knock seemed to carry something familiar. He walked to the door slowly, unsure who it could be. When he opened it, his eyes widened. There stood Sandra, holding a cake that said, "Happy Birthday, Keanu," in simple white letters. No decorations, no cameras, no noise. Just sincerity. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Years of friendship, unspoken care, and mutual respect filled the space between them. Sandra smiled gently and said, "You didn't think I'd forget, did you?" Keanu blinked, his eyes glistening with quiet surprise. "You remembered," he said softly, almost as if he didn't believe it. "Of course I did," she replied. "You've spent so many birthdays alone. I thought maybe this time you shouldn't." He stepped aside, still stunned. The air between them felt warm, calm, and strangely heavy with unspoken emotions. The cake trembled slightly in her hands as she walked in. Keanu's house was simple. Books everywhere, a small piano near the window, and a single framed photo of his late loved ones. Sandra placed the cake on the table and turned to him. "You live so quietly," she whispered, almost in awe. "Quiet feels safe," he said. "Noise reminds me of things I lost." She looked at him for a long moment. "Maybe some noise is worth hearing again?" The silence that followed carried 1,000 memories. She looked around and noticed an old notebook lying open. Sketches of motorcycles, lines of poetry, and small handwritten notes. She touched one of them and smiled faintly. "You still write," she said. "Only when words don't hurt," he replied. They shared a simple dinner she insisted on ordering, laughing at old memories from movie sets. Each laugh carried both joy and melancholy, like echoes of a time when everything felt lighter. After dinner, Sandra lit the candles and told him to make a wish. He stared at the small flames for a long time before saying, "I wish for peace. Not fame, not things, just peace." And then he blew them out. The room grew dim, except for the faint glow of the candles. Sandra watched his face in the soft light. She saw not a star, but a man who had given much to the world and taken very little for himself. For the first time in years, Keanu smiled fully. The kind of smile that comes from being seen, not as a name, but as a person. But just as the warmth of that moment filled the room, Sandra noticed something on his table, a sealed letter with her name on it. She frowned slightly and asked, "What's that?" Keanu looked startled. He tried to speak but stopped himself. His hand trembled as he picked up the letter. "It's something I wrote a long time ago," he said quietly. "But I never had the courage to give it to you." The room went still. Sandra's eyes softened. "Why?" Keanu looked down, his voice barely audible. "Because some truths can change everything." She took a small step closer, her heartbeat quickening. "Then maybe it's time to know." He hesitated, then handed her the letter. She looked at the sealed envelope in her hands, the edges slightly worn with time. Whatever was inside felt heavy with meaning. As she slowly opened it, the wind outside grew louder, like the world itself was holding its breath. And before she could read a single line, Keanu whispered, "Just remember whatever you read. It came from a place of love." The scene faded into silence, with the letter trembling in her hand and Keanu's eyes fixed on hers, full of fear, honesty, and something that had been waiting years to be spoken. The screen would fade to black here for the end of part 1. The letter that changed everything. The candlelight flickered gently as Sandra Bullock stared at the letter in her trembling hands. The air between her and Keanu Reeves was filled with a strange stillness, almost too heavy to breathe through. The sound of distant rain against the window made the moment feel slower, deeper, as if the world itself was pausing to listen. Keanu sat across from her, his head slightly bowed, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table. It wasn't often that he looked nervous. He was known for calmness, for control, for grace under pressure. But right now his calm had cracks. His eyes carried the quiet fear of someone who had opened a part of himself he had long tried to keep closed. Sandra slowly broke the seal of the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. It was aged slightly, like it had been written long ago and kept hidden. She unfolded it, her hands shaking as she began to read the first line. The letter said, "Dear Sandra, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, it means I finally found courage. I wanted to tell you what I could never say out loud. From the day we met, you changed something in me, not just as a friend or a co-star, but as a soul that reminded me how to feel again." Her eyes moved slowly over each word, her breath catching as she continued reading. "You once told me that kindness is strength. I didn't believe it back then. I thought silence was safer. But after watching the way you move through this world, with laughter, with care, with that light that never fades, I realized you were right. You made me believe that gentleness could survive even in a world that breaks hearts." Sandra paused, her vision blurring with tears she didn't expect. She blinked quickly, swallowing the emotion rising in her throat. Keanu sat quietly, watching her read, his heart pounding. The next line made her stop completely. "There were days when I wanted to tell you that you were the closest thing to peace I ever found. But I stayed quiet because I didn't want to burden your world with mine." The room fell silent. The sound of the rain grew softer, fading into nothing. Sandra slowly lowered the letter and looked at him. Her voice came out soft but full of emotion. Keanu. When did you write this? He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the floor. Years ago, after the lake house. I never meant for you to see it. I just kept it as a reminder of what truth felt like. She nodded slowly, processing his words. You've carried this for years? He smiled faintly, almost shyly. Yeah, I guess I got used to carrying things that never find their way out. She looked at him carefully, her heart aching in a way she couldn't quite define. Why didn't you ever say anything? His voice was low, filled with something fragile. Because life happened. People moved on. And because I didn't want what we had to change. Sometimes silence feels safer than confession. Sandra folded the letter gently, her fingers brushing over the paper like it was something sacred. You've always been too kind for your own good. He smiled again, but it was the kind of smile that hides pain. You think kindness is easy? Sometimes it's the hardest thing to hold on to. They sat in silence for a long time, the kind that says more than words ever could. Sandra leaned back slightly, her thoughts swirling. She remembered moments, small, quiet moments from the past, that suddenly felt different now. The way he looked at her during long filming days, the unspoken comfort between them, the times he'd stayed behind just to make sure she laughed before leaving. She had noticed those things but never understood them fully until now. You know, she said softly, I used to wonder why you always walked away before people could thank you. It's like you didn't want to be seen. He nodded slowly. Maybe I was afraid that if people looked too closely, they'd see how much I was still healing. She reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. His skin was warm, his fingers slightly tense. For a moment, neither spoke. You're not alone anymore, she said finally. He looked up, meeting her eyes. You say that so easily. Because it's true, she replied. You've spent so much time giving others light, Keanu. Maybe it's time someone gave it back to you. His expression softened, but before he could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. Both of them turned, startled. Keanu frowned slightly. I wasn't expecting anyone, Sandra whispered. Maybe a fan? He shook his head. No one knows I live here. Not really. He walked to the door, his footsteps quiet. When he opened it, a small boy stood outside, no older than 9. He was holding a folded piece of paper and wearing an oversized jacket soaked from the rain. Are you Mr. Reeves? The boy asked shyly. Keanu nodded, surprised. Yeah, who are you, kid? The lady at the park told me to give this to you, the boy said, handing him the paper. She said you'd understand. Keanu's brow furrowed as he took it. What lady? But the boy just smiled, shrugged, and ran off into the street before Keanu could stop him. Sandra stood near the table, watching with growing concern. What is it? She asked as Keanu unfolded the note. He read it silently, and his face changed. Something deep, something haunted flickered in his eyes. He handed her the note without saying a word. She took it, and in simple handwriting it said, You once promised you'd come back to the old bench when the world felt heavy. It's time. Sandra looked up. What does this mean? Keanu's voice was low. It's from someone I used to know. Someone I haven't seen in years. Someone important? He nodded slowly. Very. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The clock ticked softly in the corner. Then Sandra stood, determination lighting her eyes. Then let's go. He looked at her in disbelief. Now? Yes, now, she said firmly. If that person reached out tonight on your birthday, it means something. Let's find out what. Keanu hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. But something about the moment, the letter, the boy, Sandra's sudden arrival felt too connected to ignore, so he grabbed his coat, and together, they stepped out into the night. The streets were quiet, wet with the last trace of rain. The air smelled of earth and memory. Sandra followed Keanu's lead as they walked through winding alleys past flickering streetlights, until they reached a small park near the edge of the city, the same one where Keanu had spoken to the old man earlier that day. They found the bench under a large oak tree. The place looked ordinary, yet strangely sacred. Sandra could feel the weight of something unsaid in the air. Keanu sat down slowly, his hands clasped together. "I used to come here years ago," he said softly. "When I couldn't talk to anyone, when grief felt too heavy." She sat beside him, close enough to feel his warmth. "And the woman? She was someone who helped me when I lost everything," he said. "She used to sit here too. She said this bench keeps secrets. It listens and never judges." Sandra smiled faintly. "Sounds like you." He looked at her, and for a moment, time stood still. The moonlight brushed across their faces. There was peace, but also something else, an energy, as if the past and present were finally meeting in one place. Just then, a soft sound came from the shadows behind the trees. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Sandra turned her head, her breath catching. A woman stepped into the faint light, her face half hidden by a hood. Keanu's eyes widened in shock. "No!" he whispered. "It can't be." The woman smiled faintly, her voice low and calm. "You kept your promise, Keanu," and Sandra, confused but sensing the depth of the moment, realized that whoever this woman was, she carried a piece of Keanu's past that had never truly let him go. The wind grew stronger, the candles from the cake flickering out in the distance of memory. Keanu stood slowly, his eyes locked on the figure before him. "You're supposed to be gone," he said, voice trembling. The woman lifted her head, revealing a face filled with both pain and peace. "Some goodbyes," she whispered. "Don't last forever." And just like that, the night around them seemed to breathe again, soft, alive, waiting for truths long buried to rise. Ghosts of the past, the night had grown colder, and the wind carried a strange whisper through the leaves. The woman standing before Keanu and Sandra seemed both real and unreal, like someone who had walked out of a forgotten dream. Her eyes glowed faintly beneath the hood, filled with something ancient, grief, forgiveness, and something deeper that even words couldn't name. Sandra glanced at Keanu, her heart pounding. His face had gone pale, his eyes locked on the woman as though the world around him had vanished. He took one small step forward, the sound of his boots pressing softly into the damp ground. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, voice trembling. "You can't be here." The woman smiled sadly. "I wasn't supposed to be gone either." Sandra felt a chill run through her spine. She looked from one to the other, her mind racing. "Keanu," she whispered. "Who is she?" He didn't answer. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. His throat tightened, and his eyes grew wet with emotion he had buried for too long. Finally, after a long silence, he spoke softly. "This is Elena," he said, barely above a whisper. "She was someone I lost a long time ago." Elena lowered her hood, revealing dark hair streaked with silver and eyes that carried both love and sorrow. "You never lost me, Keanu," she said gently. "You just stopped believing I could still reach you." The world seemed to hold its breath. Sandra's hands gripped the edge of the bench, unsure whether what she was seeing was a memory or a miracle. She didn't know this woman, but she could feel the history between them, the quiet bond that once existed, the pain that lingered. "I don't understand," Sandra said softly. "Are you saying she's—" Elena turned to her and smiled faintly. "Gone, maybe, but some connections don't fade, not even after death." Keanu's heart pounded as he whispered, "I thought you were gone forever. I went to the hospital that night and they said—" Elena nodded slowly. "They said I didn't make it. But I did, for a while. I stayed silent because I didn't want you to stop living your life. You were already carrying so much." He stepped closer, eyes glistening with disbelief. "You let me believe you were dead?" Her voice broke. "I thought it was mercy, not cruelty." "I didn't know it would break you this much." Tears gathered in Keanu's eyes. He took another step closer, his breath trembling. "You were the only person who understood what silence meant to me. And you were the only one who understood that love isn't always about holding on," Elena whispered. The words hung in the air, fragile and haunting. Sandra watched silently, her heart aching for both of them. She had seen Keanu calm and composed through the hardest times, but she had never seen him like this, vulnerable, raw, stripped of all the quiet walls he had built. He sat slowly on the bench, as if his strength had left him. Elena stood before him, her hands clasped. "You wrote that letter to Sandra because part of you wanted to speak the truth you never told me," she said gently. "You were trying to forgive yourself." Keanu looked up, tears running down his face. "I couldn't forgive myself for not being there. I thought if I had just done something differently." "You can't rewrite the past," she said, stepping closer. "But you can stop punishing yourself for it." Sandra's eyes softened. She could see now that the woman's presence was more than a ghost. It was memory given form, forgiveness wrapped in mystery. Something in her own heart stirred as she watched them, realizing that every human being carried at least one story of someone they could never let go of. "Elena?" Sandra said quietly. "Why now? Why tonight?" Elena turned to her and smiled. "Because tonight he finally allowed himself to be seen. You came into his silence, Sandra. You reminded him that connection still matters. And when a heart begins to open again, even the ones that were gone can find their way back." Sandra's throat tightened. She had come to surprise a friend on his birthday, not knowing she would become part of something much deeper, a reunion between life and what lies beyond it. Keanu reached out, his hand trembling. "If you're really here, if this isn't just a dream, tell me what I should do." Elena kneeled before him, her eyes full of compassion. "Live," she said simply. "Stop surviving and start living. Stop walking through days as if they're punishment. Forgive yourself. And remember, love doesn't disappear. It just changes its shape." Her voice grew softer with each word, like wind fading into a distant melody. Sandra blinked and suddenly realized Elena's outline was starting to fade, her form dissolving slowly into the night air. Keanu's heart raced. "No, please, don't go yet." Elena smiled one last time. "You don't need me anymore." "She's here now." And with that, she vanished like mist, leaving only a faint warmth where she had stood. Sandra sat frozen, her mind spinning between disbelief and wonder. She turned to Keanu, who sat motionless, staring at the empty space before him. Minutes passed before he finally spoke, his voice cracking. "I thought I was imagining it, but I could feel her presence, her words. It felt real." Sandra reached for his hand, holding it firmly. "Sometimes reality isn't about what we can see, Keanu. Sometimes it's about what we can finally accept." He looked at her, eyes full of gratitude and exhaustion. "I don't know why you showed up today, but it feels like the universe brought you here for a reason," she smiled softly. "Maybe it did. Maybe your birthday isn't about candles or cake this time. Maybe it's about healing." They sat together in silence for a long while. The stars began to appear, one by one, faint glimmers above the city. The world felt softer now, less heavy. Keanu looked down at the ground and saw something glinting under the bench. He reached down and picked it up, a small locket, old and silver. He opened it, and inside was a tiny photograph of him and Elena, taken long ago, with a small note folded behind it. His breath caught as he unfolded the paper. "When you find this, it means you finally came back. Now go live." His tears returned, but this time they carried relief instead of sorrow. He placed the locket in his palm, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you." Sandra leaned her head against the back of the bench. "She gave you closure," she said quietly. "That's rare." "Maybe she gave me a beginning," he replied. They sat there until dawn began to color the sky with faint gold. The city started to wake, cars humming faintly in the distance. Sandra looked at him and said softly, "So what now?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I think I'll start with breakfast." They both laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that carries healing. As they stood to leave, Keanu looked back one last time at the empty bench. He could swear he heard a soft whisper, gentle, calm, like the breeze through leaves, saying, "You're free now." He turned back to Sandra, eyes warm again. "Thank you for showing up tonight." "Thank you for letting me," she said, as they walked away from the park. The camera of life pulled slowly back, the two figures walking side by side, one carrying peace he had long forgotten, the other carrying gratitude for being part of something beyond understanding. But just as the frame seemed to settle into quiet resolution, Sandra's phone buzzed. She glanced down and frowned. The message had no name, no number, just one line. You brought him peace. Now it's your turn. She stopped walking. Keanu looked back, concern on his face. Everything okay? She nodded slowly, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Yeah, everything's fine, but her heart was racing, because she knew somehow that the message wasn't random. Someone or something wasn't done yet. The screen would fade here as they walked toward the rising sun, the air thick with mystery and promise. The message that followed her home. The city was just waking up when Sandra and Keanu drove back from the park. The early morning light painted soft golden streaks on the empty streets, and for a while they didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't heavy this time. It was gentle, calm, the kind of silence that comes after something sacred has happened. Keanu's eyes were focused on the road, but Sandra kept glancing at her phone. That one message still glowed on the screen. You brought him peace. Now it's your turn. She had read it more than 10 times already, and every time it sent a shiver down her spine. She hadn't replied. She didn't know what to say, or who to say it to. When they finally reached Keanu's house, he parked the car quietly and turned to her. You sure you're okay? She forced a small smile. Yeah, just tired, I guess. He studied her for a second. You've been holding it together all night. You can rest now. What about you? He chuckled softly. For the first time in a long time, I think I'll actually sleep. She smiled at that. His words carried warmth again, something she hadn't seen in his tone for years. After a short goodbye, she drove away, the soft hum of her car fading into the distance. But as she drove through the morning fog, she couldn't stop thinking about that message. It felt personal, almost intimate, as if whoever had sent it knew more than they should. She reached home just as the sun climbed higher. Her house felt quiet, too quiet, like the world outside had stopped moving. She placed her phone on the kitchen counter and made herself coffee. The scent filled the air, grounding her in something familiar. But when she turned back to her phone, the screen lit up again. Another message. Don't ignore it. You've carried your own silence for too long. Sandra froze. Her fingers tightened around the cup. She quickly typed back, Who is this? No reply. Just 3 blinking dots for a few seconds, then nothing. She tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a glitch, a prank, someone hacking an old contact. She deleted the messages and put the phone face down. But deep down, something in her chest whispered that this was more than that. She walked into her living room, where sunlight poured through the curtains. The walls were covered with framed memories, movie sets, friends, awards, smiles. But one picture caught her attention. It was from years ago, her and her mother standing by the beach, laughing. She hadn't looked at it in ages. Her mother had passed away quietly, long before her fame ever reached its peak. And suddenly, that whisper inside her grew louder. She sat on the couch, staring at the picture. You brought him peace. Now it's your turn. The words echoed in her mind again. What if it wasn't random? What if it was a message from something beyond her understanding? Just like Elena's message had reached Keanu. She shook her head quickly, trying to push the thought away. No, she whispered. Not again. This isn't real. But the air around her shifted subtly. A soft gust passed through the room, even though no window was open. Her coffee cup rattled slightly on the table. Then, from somewhere deep in the house, she heard a faint sound. Like music. A piano. Her breath caught. She didn't own a piano. For a few seconds, she couldn't move. She just stood there, heart thudding loudly in her chest. The notes were soft, slow, delicate, playing a melody she hadn't heard in years. And then she realized what it was. It was the song her mother used to play every night before bed. She whispered shakily, No, it can't be. The music stopped as suddenly as it started. Silence returned, thick and cold. She slowly walked toward the sound's direction, down the hallway, her footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floor. The air felt heavier now, filled with something unseen but deeply felt. When she reached her old guest room, she froze. On the small table near the window, a single white rose lay there, fresh, alive, glistening with morning dew. Beside it was a folded note. She picked it up, her hands trembling. You were there when he needed light. Now let yours be seen too. Her chest tightened. She whispered into the empty room. Who are you? No answer. Only the quiet hum of morning light slipping through the curtains. She sat down slowly, holding the rose in her hands. It smelled faintly of salt water and jasmine, the same scent her mother always wore. Tears welled in her eyes, uninvited but unstoppable. She hadn't cried in years, not since she learned to hold her emotions behind polite smiles for cameras and interviews. But now, it all came back. The loneliness of fame, the exhaustion of pretending everything was fine, the silent grief she had never shared with anyone, not even Keanu. She buried her face in her hands and whispered, "What does peace even mean anymore?" Just then, her phone buzzed again. Another message. It means forgiveness. She looked up sharply, wiping her tears. Her fingers shook as she typed. Forgiveness for what? The reply came instantly. For leaving when you thought it was love. For holding guilt that was never yours. Her breath caught. She stared at the screen, her mind spinning. How could anyone know that? That pain was buried deep, locked away in a chapter of her life she had never spoken about publicly, a chapter that began before her career, when she was still learning what love and heartbreak really meant. She whispered, "This isn't possible," but the phone buzzed again. "Go to the lake, where you first learned to let go. I'll be waiting." She didn't move for several seconds. The words looked ordinary, but they didn't feel ordinary. She knew exactly which lake it meant. It was the same one from her childhood, the place she went to after her mother's funeral, the same lake where she filmed The Lake House years later. Her heart began to race. Within minutes, she grabbed her coat and car keys. Something inside her knew she couldn't ignore this, the same way Keanu couldn't ignore the boy and the letter. As she drove, the city slowly gave way to open roads, and memories began to surface like ghosts. Her mother's laughter, her younger self sitting by the water, the feeling of peace she had lost somewhere between fame and fear. The drive felt endless, yet time moved strangely fast. When she finally reached the lake, it was quiet. Still. Silver light rippled across the surface of the water. She stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the cool morning air. "Okay," she whispered. "I'm here." For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of wind brushing through the trees. She almost thought it had been a mistake. And then she saw her. A woman standing near the water wearing a pale blue dress that fluttered gently in the breeze. Her back was turned, her hair moving softly in the wind. Sandra's voice trembled. "Mom?" The woman turned slowly, and Sandra's knees almost gave out. It was her mother. Exactly as she remembered her, warm and kind, her eyes filled with both love and understanding. "You came," her mother said softly. Tears flooded Sandra's eyes. "How is this possible?" Her mother smiled faintly. "You've been carrying too much for too long. I couldn't rest until you let it go." Sandra took a hesitant step forward. "I thought I moved on." "No, my love," her mother said. "You just learned to hide it. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering without pain." Sandra shook her head, crying harder. "I wasn't there enough. I was busy. I missed your last day." Her mother reached out, touching her cheek gently. "You don't owe me guilt. You gave me pride. You gave me joy. And now you need to give yourself peace." Sandra closed her eyes, leaning into that touch that felt both real and unreal. Warmth spread through her chest like sunlight after rain. "How do I do that?" she whispered. "Start by forgiving the parts of you that were only trying to survive." For a long while, neither spoke. The world around them seemed to slow, as if the lake itself was listening. The water shimmered softly, reflecting both their faces like a mirror of memory. Finally, her mother said gently, "You helped someone heal last night. Now it's time to heal yourself. Tell him what's in your heart. Don't wait until silence becomes regret." And before Sandra could speak again, the light around her mother began to fade. "No, please," Sandra whispered. "Don't go yet," her mother smiled. "I'm never far. You just have to listen." And then she was gone. Sandra stood there, breath trembling, the sound of gentle waves brushing against the shore. In her hand, she still held the white rose, now glowing faintly under the morning sun. She whispered, "Thank you." As she turned back toward her car, her phone buzzed one last time. Peace isn't found in the past. It begins with what you say next. She stared at the message for a long time, and deep inside, she knew exactly what it meant. She needed to go back to Keanu. The camera of the story would fade out here, Sandra driving away from the lake, tears still drying on her face, determination beginning to rise in her eyes, the sunrise casting gold over the horizon, and somewhere far behind her, the lake shimmered quietly, still, eternal, like it had kept one more secret safe. When the heart finally spoke, the road back to Los Angeles felt longer than usual. Sandra's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from the weight of everything she had just experienced. The lake still shimmered in her mind like a reflection she couldn't escape. Her mother's words echoed softly in her heart. Peace begins with what you say next. She repeated those words over and over until they became a quiet rhythm in her chest. She didn't fully understand what had happened at the lake, whether it was a dream, a vision, or something beyond reason. But she knew one thing clearly now. She couldn't keep silence anymore. Not with Keanu. Not with herself. The city welcomed her back with noise and sunlight. Cars filled the streets. People rushed past sidewalks, and the world looked normal again. But she felt different. Lighter, yet more vulnerable. When she reached Keanu's house, she parked outside and sat there for a few moments. Her fingers rested on the car keys, hesitant. Part of her wanted to drive away, to pretend the night before was just a beautiful memory. But another part of her, the one that had listened to her mother's voice, whispered that she needed to finish what they started. She finally stepped out of the car. The house was quiet, peaceful, almost too peaceful. She knocked once, softly, no answer. She tried again. Still nothing. Just as she turned to leave, the door opened slowly, revealing Keanu standing there, sleepy-eyed but calm. His hair was slightly messy, his voice low and gentle. "Sandra," he said, surprised. "It's early. Is everything okay?" She smiled faintly. "Can I come in?" He nodded and stepped aside. The living room still looked the same. Books scattered everywhere. A quiet hum of music playing faintly in the background. And the half-burnt candle from the night before still sitting on the table. It smelled like vanilla and rain. Keanu looked at her carefully. "You look like you've been driving for hours." "I have," she said softly. "I went to the lake." His eyes widened slightly. "The lake?" She nodded. "The same one you and Elena talked about. The one you went to when the world felt heavy." Keanu sat down slowly, his expression shifting between confusion and curiosity. "Why?" She took a deep breath. "Because someone told me to." He frowned slightly. "Someone?" "My mother," she whispered. The words hung in the air, soft but powerful. Keanu's eyes softened instantly. "You mean, in a dream?" "No," she said. "Not exactly. I don't even know what to call it. But I saw her, Keanu. She spoke to me. She said I needed to forgive myself. That piece starts with what I say next." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening intently. There was no judgment in his eyes, only quiet understanding. Sandra looked down, her hands shaking slightly. "I never told anyone this before, but for years I've carried guilt I couldn't explain. When my mom was sick, I wasn't there enough. I was always working, always somewhere else, pretending everything was fine. I thought success could fill the spaces that grief left empty. But it never did. It just made the silence louder." Her voice trembled as she spoke, tears gathering in her eyes. "And last night," she continued, "when I saw you with Elena, when I saw you forgive yourself, I realized how long I've been running from the same thing." Keanu's gaze softened further. "Sandra!" "No, let me finish," she said gently, wiping her tears. "My mother told me to tell you what's in my heart. So I will." She took a deep breath and looked directly at him. "You weren't the only one who kept things unsaid, Keanu. For years, I've carried something too. I admired you. I cared about you more than I ever let myself admit. And maybe, in another time, we could have had more than friendship. But I was scared. Scared to ruin what we had. Scared to lose the only person who ever truly understood me." Her words trembled, but came from a place of truth she could no longer hold back. Keanu sat perfectly still, his heart pounding in his chest. He had dreamed of hearing those words once years ago, but never thought they'd actually come. She continued, her voice softer now. When I read your letter, I realized we've both been living with unfinished stories. Maybe it's not about what could have been. Maybe it's about finally saying what should have been said. Keanu stood slowly and walked to the window. Sunlight poured across his face, highlighting the quiet storm inside him. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Sandra's heart raced with every passing second. Finally, he turned to her. "You know what's strange?" he said quietly. "Last night, before you came over, I almost threw that letter away. I thought it was pointless to hold on to old feelings. But now I see it wasn't about the past. It was about giving truth one last chance to breathe." Sandra smiled faintly, tears still shining in her eyes. "Maybe the universe doesn't want us to forget. Maybe it just wants us to understand." He nodded slowly, walking closer to her. "You've always had a way of making everything sound simple and beautiful." "That's because you make it easy," she whispered. They stood there, inches apart, the air between them thick with emotion that had waited years to find its way out. Keanu's hand lifted slightly, hesitant, then rested gently against her cheek. "I don't know what this means," he said softly, "but I know it feels right." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "Sometimes right doesn't need to mean forever. Sometimes it just means now." They stood like that for a long moment, two souls who had spent their lives giving light to others, finally finding a small piece of it for themselves. Then Keanu pulled back slightly, his voice lower. "You know what Elena said before she faded away? She said, 'I don't need her anymore because you're here now.' I didn't understand it then, but I think I do now." Sandra smiled gently. "Maybe love doesn't end, Keanu. Maybe it just changes who it moves through." He nodded, tears forming in his eyes again. "She helped me find peace, and you reminded me that life can still surprise me." For the first time in years, Keanu laughed softly, a genuine, warm laugh. Sandra laughed too through her tears, and the room filled with something light and alive again. "You know," she said, smiling through emotion, "if people saw us right now, they'd probably write a whole new story about us." "Let them," he said. "We've spent enough time living other people's stories." They both sat down at the table, and Keanu poured coffee into 2 cups. For a few minutes, they said nothing. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was peaceful, the kind of silence that heals. After a while, Sandra looked at him and said softly, "I think I know what my mother meant. Peace doesn't come from forgetting the pain. It comes from forgiving the version of ourselves that didn't know better." Keanu smiled, and from finally saying the things that should have been said, she nodded, looking down at her cup. "Then maybe it's time we both write one more letter. Not to anyone else. Just to ourselves." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "A letter?" "Yes," she said. "To thank the versions of us that survived everything we never talked about." He smiled softly. "I like that." They spent the rest of the morning writing quietly, side by side. The sunlight grew brighter, falling across the table, across their notebooks, across their faces. After some time, Sandra finished hers and folded it neatly. Keanu did the same. They exchanged a look that needed no words. He said quietly, "What will you do with yours?" She smiled. "Maybe burn it. Maybe keep it. But I think the words are what mattered." He nodded. "Same here." Then, almost as if guided by instinct, he took her hand and said softly, "Thank you for coming back." She squeezed his hand gently. "Thank you for opening the door." The room fell silent again, not empty, but full of peace, the kind that comes after years of silence finding its voice. But just as the calm settled, a sudden knock came at the door, sharp, deliberate. Both of them turned their heads. Keanu frowned slightly. Who could that be? He stood and walked to the door slowly, unsure. When he opened it, a delivery man stood there holding a small brown package. "Delivery for Mr. Reeves," the man said. "No sender name." Keanu nodded, thanked him, and brought it inside. Sandra watched as he opened the box carefully. Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with delicate patterns. There was a note attached. He unfolded it and read silently. His expression changed, and confusion first, then shock. Sandra stood. "What is it?" He handed her the note. It said, "Two hearts that speak truth deserve to finish what was once paused. Meet me where it all began." Below it was a location, the old movie studio, the set where Speed had been filmed nearly 3 decades ago. Sandra looked up slowly. "This can't be real." Keanu shook his head, equally stunned. "No one else would know that line. Then who sent it?" she asked softly. He looked out the window, the sunlight reflecting in his eyes. "I don't know, but something tells me this story isn't finished yet. The camera of life would fade here, their faces half lit by sunlight, the note between them glowing softly, the promise of something mysterious yet meaningful, waiting just beyond the next chapter." Where it all began, the afternoon sun stretched across the city, long shadows spilling through the streets as Sandra and Keanu drove toward the address written on the note. The world outside looked ordinary, but their hearts were anything but. The silence between them was alive with questions neither dared to ask yet. The location led them to a quiet area of Los Angeles, a place that time seemed to have forgotten. When they turned the corner and stopped, Sandra gasped softly. It was the old studio lot, the one where Speed had been filmed decades ago. The once bustling space now looked abandoned, covered with ivy and soft dust. Keanu parked the car and turned to her. "It's strange," he said quietly. "This place looks smaller than I remember." She smiled faintly. "Maybe we just got bigger." They stepped out together, walking slowly through the cracked pavement and faded paint. The air smelled faintly of rust and memory. As they entered the open lot, everything felt like it had been waiting for them. The old bus from the film still sat under a tarp, its metal sides catching the light. Sandra reached out and ran her fingers along it, a small smile forming on her lips. "We were just kids," she said softly. "We didn't know what the world would become." Keanu nodded. "We didn't know what we would become." They walked deeper into the lot, until they reached the sound stage where it had all begun, the very place where their first scene together had been filmed. The heavy doors creaked as Keanu pushed them open. Inside, sunlight spilled through broken glass panels, illuminating dust floating in the air like tiny golden stars. In the center of the empty space stood something unexpected. A small table, 2 chairs, and a single candle. On the table lay another envelope. Sandra and Keanu exchanged a look, their hearts racing. "This is starting to feel like a movie," Sandra whispered. Keanu smiled faintly. "Except this one's writing itself." He stepped forward and picked up the envelope. It was unsealed, the handwriting soft and familiar. He unfolded the note and began to read aloud. "Dear Keanu and Sandra, some stories are not meant to end, only to evolve. You both carried silence for too long, and now that it has finally spoken, the world feels lighter. This place was your beginning, not just as actors, but as souls who found understanding in each other. Today, you are not here for a scene. You are here for closure, and for truth." He paused, his throat tightening. Sandra stepped closer, looking at the letter. The next lines were written differently, gentler, almost poetic. "Love does not always mean possession. Sometimes it means presence. Sometimes it means standing beside someone and saying, 'I see you, and that's enough.' You both gave that gift to each other. Now it's time to give it to yourselves." Sandra's eyes glistened as she whispered, "Who wrote this?" Keanu shook his head. "I don't know, but whoever it was, they understood us." As they stood there, a faint breeze swept through the open space. The candle flickered but didn't go out. Instead, it burned steadier, brighter, and then a soft voice echoed through the room. Not loud, not sharp, but clear. "Thank you for keeping your promise." They both turned sharply. At the far end of the soundstage stood 2 familiar figures, Elena, and behind her, Sandra's mother. They were faint, shimmering in the golden light, more presence than body, more warmth than form. Sandra covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes. "Mom," Keanu's voice trembled. Elena smiled softly. "We couldn't leave without saying goodbye properly." Her mother stepped forward, her voice calm and full of grace. You two helped each other heal. That's what love does. It doesn't always bind. Sometimes it frees. Sandra sobbed quietly, stepping closer, but her mother held up a gentle hand. You don't need to reach me, sweetheart. I've always been here, in every kind thing you've done. Keanu stood beside Sandra, unable to move, every emotion he had ever buried rising to the surface. Elena turned to him. You kept your word, Keanu. You came back. You forgave yourself, and you opened your heart again, something I thought you'd never do. He swallowed hard. I couldn't have done it without her. Elena smiled at Sandra. I know. That's why you were both chosen. To remind each other that love and loss don't exist separately. They walk hand in hand. The air shimmered gently as both women stepped closer. Their presence filled the room with warmth, the kind of peace that didn't belong to this world. Sandra's mother looked at her daughter with soft eyes. You were never meant to carry guilt. You were meant to live. Promise me you'll keep doing that for you. Sandra nodded through tears. I promise. Elena turned to Keanu. And you, promise me you'll stop walking through life like you're saying goodbye to it. He smiled faintly, eyes wet. I promise. The two women smiled, their forms glowing brighter. Then our work is done, Elena said softly. Sandra's mother reached out her hand one last time. You found each other again, and that means the story continues. As their light grew brighter, Sandra whispered, Will I see you again? Her mother's voice was like a song. You don't need to. You'll feel me, in every sunrise, in every act of kindness, in every quiet moment you choose peace. And then, slowly, they faded into the golden light, leaving behind only stillness and warmth. Sandra stood frozen for a moment before Keanu gently took her hand. They stood there quietly, their fingers intertwined, the candle still burning between them. After a long silence, Sandra whispered, It feels like they wanted us to find something. Keanu nodded. Maybe they wanted us to understand that love doesn't disappear. It just changes its home. She smiled softly, tears still shining in her eyes. And maybe peace isn't something we find. Maybe it's something we finally allow. He looked at her, the corner of his lips lifting. You always know how to say things better than I do. No, she said gently. We just finally stopped hiding. For a long while, they stood there, the two of them surrounded by the quiet hum of old memories and new beginnings. The candle's flame flickered one last time before going out, leaving only the faint light of the setting sun streaming through the broken windows. They walked outside together hand in hand. The air was cool, calm, alive with something unseen but comforting. Behind them, the studio stood still, carrying the echoes of laughter, tears, and everything they had just released. As they reached the car, Sandra turned to look one last time. It's strange, she said. The first time we came here, we were pretending to be two people in love. Now we're just two people learning what love really means. Keanu smiled, starting the car. Maybe that's the best kind of story. The one that ends with truth. They drove off slowly, the last rays of sunlight touching the edge of the old studio walls. Somewhere behind them, unseen but felt, two soft voices whispered together, proud, peaceful, and free. And for the first time in years, both Keanu and Sandra smiled without sadness in their eyes. They didn't need to say anything else. The silence between them said it all. The story had come full circle, not with fireworks or applause, but with peace. And in the quiet glow of evening, they both knew that sometimes the most beautiful endings are the ones that finally let your heart rest.